This is Bold Talk Business Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, the CEO of Bold Marketing Solutions, Donna Anselmo.
This is Donna Anselmo at Bold Talk Business Radio, and this is the show where we deliver every week insight, strategies, tips, and tools for success. And we define success not only as getting good stuff, but as being really satisfied with where you are in your life and in your work, because success and satisfaction should go hand in hand. Today we have with us on Bold Talk Business Radio our co-host, Peter Anselmo.
Good to be here.
And Dr. Diane Kramer, who has been a frequent guest on Bold Talk Business Radio because she brings so much to the table in terms of helping us bridge the gap between our inner lives and our outer lives. What are we thinking, feeling, and believing inside? What kind of personal stories are we telling to ourselves? And how are those personal stories influencing what we're doing in terms of our behavior and our relationships particularly? And today, Dr. Diane Kramer, who is a clinical psychologist, a retired college professor, and I love saying the retired word to you, Diane, because I know how hard you worked all those 40 years at Nassau Community. And I can say that you've not stopped or skipped a beat in terms of your direction and your commitment to helping people move forward in their lives, whether you're doing it through your practice or whether you're doing it through online media. And right now I know, because you and I are working together on building the Bold Heart Power Program, Bold Heart Learning, which is an e-learning platform that we will be able to very shortly share with our listeners and invite you to come aboard and do a test demo. But for today, what we were going to talk about is the power in relationships. And we want to show you some things that you can think about to really power up the success and satisfaction in the relationships that you're building in your life. And Dr. Diane Kramer, as a longtime clinician and marriage therapist, what are some of the key ingredients for having the kind of relationship that people want to have? And then why aren't they having those now?
There's lots of answers to that one. But the key ingredients. The first ingredient is the ability to hold the mirror to yourself. You know, I'm a Buddhist, and that's taught in Buddhism. Hold the mirror to yourself. You look at your own part in things. If you can't do that, you get caught up in your automatic conditioning, your automatic programming. You react to the other person reacts back to you, and before you know it, it's explosion, right? So you need to stop and look at yourself, get mindful, and hold the mirror up to yourself. And notice your own part. And it's so hard for people. People want to be right, and they believe they're correct, or they're protecting their territory, or their ego says, you know, no, I'm correct, or I have to have it this way. And often they project out to the other person any bad feelings.
And I think
it's all coming from the other person.
Yeah, I think often what happens too, and I know we've discussed this in the past, is that there's like a mental framework that people get into, which is, I'm right, and if I'm right, then you're wrong. And,
right.
And it's only black or white, and there's only one way to look at things.
Exactly. And the real truth is that people are looking at their own set of conclusions they've come to based on what's important to them. So I'll give you a real quick example. So I've got a guy in my practice who, what he wants is to be loved and cared about. His wife was busy with the 4 kids. He went off and had an affair. And his wife is mad at him about the affair, but he's mad at her for not having been there to give him the attention and the caring he needed. So who's right? There is no right. It's very hard to forgive an affair, for example, but still, he was looking for something that she could not provide. She's looking for what he did to her. He betrayed her. So between them, they've got 2 different stories going about, you know, what's important to each, what the other one has done wrong to hurt them. People only look at their own part and, you know, hurt. You hurt me, therefore you're the bad guy.
Right.
Okay.
So when
they look at different things, though.
Sure. And when those relationships go awry, it increases stress. People feel stressed. They become more critical. They attack the other person. They blame. Then they feel disappointed that they don't get what they want. So go ahead.
Well, we call that the vicious circle or the vicious cycle. So when people come to my office for marriage counseling, already they've been in the vicious cycle a long time. The vicious cycle is the attack and withdraw patterns, the emotional overreactions that occur over and over and over again. So soon the couple they can't look at what their issues are. They don't try to work them out with good communication, with empathy, with caring for each other. Instead, they're already predicting how the other person is going to, react to them by withdrawing or by attacking. And so that's the vicious cycle. It's an emotional cycle.
I think Diane, I just got a great marketing idea. I think we need to market some T-shirts, and the word on them that your partner needs to wear is empathy, because that way when you have a visual that reminds you, oh gosh, I need to step back here and think about what that other person is feeling. So how do we get people in the middle of relationships to stop and become aware of this automatic program that they're running, or the trigger that just gets them bolting in a crazy direction?
Well, I mean, there are many different methods to do that, and that's based upon each person's individual personalities. Some people are really good at it. You tell them, look, you got to stop and get less emotional, and they'll take a deep breath, they'll let the emotions go, they'll look at their part, they really want to learn about themselves. They're open to considering that they may have a part in this situation. And if you listen to the couples talk shows, they always find for these talk shows people who are able to look at themselves. But a lot of people are not. And those are the people that are difficult. They're emotional, they blame. Inside them, they're not comfortable with themselves. There's self-attacks going on, anxiety going on. They're more concerned with trying to calm themselves down than having a good relationship. And so what happens with those people is it's very hard to get them to stop.
You are listening to Bold Talk Business Radio on TalkNetworkRadio.com today. We're thrilled to be broadcasting from Talk Network Radio and to be working with Jeff Heiser, who I'm going to tell you personally is a very, very nice man, and we've built a very nice relationship. And I would like you as a listener to come with us on this journey today through what it takes to make a relationship that will work for you. Also because we are doing a business talk show. That's what we call it. That's how we're branded, Bold Talk Business Radio. So you might wonder, well, why are you talking to a marriage counselor today? Well, first of all, marriage counseling is big business. But secondly, because what happens inside your personal relationships, you're taking to your business world. And it's that same mental set, your same mindset or mental paradigm that you're using in your business life every day, you're also following those same patterns in business. So if you can become more empathetic to other people in your business setting, if you can give your relationships in business some thought and try to kind of power them up or plus them so they get better, that's why we're talking about that on Bold Talk Business Radio today with Pete Anselmo and Dr. Diane Kramer.
And one of the things that you brought to mind here is that oftentimes when you're in business, people bring obviously they bring their psyche with them to work in the morning, and very often it spills over into all sorts of business related comments, business related events. You might get on the phone with a customer and start projecting things that have nothing to do with the customer, but everything to do with their wife or their husband, or so that the recognition that you're not in a a vacuum when you whether it's going to work or being in a business environment, that you bring your mental approach to things. You're there as a whole person, and that's what you need to recognize.
So let's talk a little bit. Dr. Diane Kramer, I wanted to ask you just a little bit about, you can finish your comment, obviously, but I'd like to get to talking a little bit about some of the resources, some of the inner resources that people need to develop in order to have the relationships that will make them satisfied and successful in life and work.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I was going to talk about a set of skills that are very important for having good relationships with the people at work. And by the way, there's a great TV program called The Profit, Profit.
With Marcus Lemonis.
Marcus Lemonis.
I love
and it. And he goes into companies that are failing, and every single one of those companies, it's because the head of the company has a personality problem that he hasn't been able to work out with himself and with his employees. So, and Marcus attempts to kind of crack the nut on those cases.
Right. A lot of times the owners are dictators.
Right.
And that often is not a personality that that you want, certainly as an employee.
So let me ask you a question.
Let me give you a good skill here. So this is a communication skill. And if you practice this in your business and you make it a regular practice, it really helps. So if each person focuses on like a series of break the communication to steps. First, let's find out what are the facts. The facts, F-A-C-T-S. Not the opinions, not the conclusions, not the beliefs, but the facts in the situation. And if you can get the two people, like the marketing and sales department or the CEO and the CFO, to agree on the facts, then the second step is for each person then to give their feelings and their conclusions, their perceptions and conclusions about those facts, because that's where the differences come in. Not the facts, but each person's feelings, perceptions, conclusions about the facts. And what you discover when they each talks about that they've got different priorities and different views on what's important, but the facts stay the same. And then since two stories are out on the table, and each person hopefully after that is asking for what they want or need, a negotiation takes place. So instead of being emotionally upset or one person being the dictator, you get the facts out first between the two people, agreement, or a person in a group, agreement. Then everybody's perceptions, conclusions, or stories, what's important, and then what each wants. And you negotiate from there.
So let's take that to a real-world example. If I am in conflict with someone and we're both angry because we're telling each other, we've got some different subtext attributed to that same fact, and we're seeing it from a different perspective. Because we're seeing it from a different perspective, and maybe because we don't really have clarity on the facts involved, and maybe not even understand where that other person fits into the whole scheme, what they're thinking about, we're making a lot of assumptions. So how do you change that?
You do a communications workshop where people are trained with step-by-step through simulations, or you bring in, I've done in corporations, I've brought, gone and found out what the problems are and put people through communications workshops based upon the real problems in the organization, where they have to do facts and they have to do conclusion. And it's good, by the way, to get people to write these things out in advance, because when you write it out in advance, there's even less chance of getting over emotional. It's kind of gives people a breathing space.
Dr. Diane Kramer, from your perspective and your experience working with people in the clinical setting, what do you think underlies all of the reactive state that people get into. Where does that actually come from? Is it just an in-the-moment thing? Is it linking them back to their prior relationship? Is it linking them all the way back to the relationship they had with their parents or the relationship that they witnessed in their home growing up?
Well, yeah, that's complex. It's linking, but it's linking with a conclusion, and very often people end up with what we call the virtual question. The question that underneath all their actions, their thoughts and feelings, they keep asking themselves at an unconscious level over and over again, which drives their thinking, feeling, and behaving outside of their awareness. So I have a guy who failed in his family business, and after that was like 30 years ago, he made the decision, this is never going to happen to me again. So his question, his virtual question is way below the surface is, are my finances okay or not? Are they okay or not? And that has become far more important than, do I have a good relationship with my wife or not? And that's why they're in therapy, because his wife is about to leave him, which will ruin his finances even more. But he can't let go of the finance. First of all, one of the reasons is why it's all so complicated. He can't let go of asking himself the virtual question about the finances because she's such a badgerer, a nag, because she's so frustrated with him that he can't tolerate listening to her. So it's like peeling an onion to get to the truth and what each person has to do.
We've talked in the past, Diane, about the fact that so many people operate in a reactive mode where they're reacting based on their perception of other people's judgment of them. So if somebody is giving them good feedback, they're feeling good today. Somebody isn't giving them good feedback, they're feeling bad, particularly if somebody gives them negative feedback and criticism and, says something that's hurtful. So when you have a situation where you're putting a story into your mind about, in the case that you just talked about, the fellow whose question was about finance. Yeah. I'm sure that there are many people, and myself included, who will sometimes go to, and I know historically I've done this, where I've said, oh, this person isn't valuing me enough. And so when you get to that heart space, that's really hard to get out of. So what do you say to people like that?
They're the people who don't feel like they're being valued enough. Mm-hmm. So they must be underneath the surface saying to themselves over and over, are people valuing me enough? Yes, feel good. No, feel bad. So they need to shift their question and really practice it too. Am I valuing me enough? And you value yourself by first accepting yourself, loving yourself, living up to your own standards, but not so high that you become a perfectionist. So if you're a good person, you love yourself, you care about yourself, and you listen to your own inner voice, right? You can feel good about yourself no matter who is saying what about you out there.
One of the thoughts that I have found to be helpful, and I heard it said a long time ago, and it made an impact on me, was very often people get into a pattern because they want to be loved and they want to be understood and they want to be viewed as a good person. They get into a pattern of trying to please everybody else. Mm-hmm. And then they have an inner conflict because trying to please somebody else doesn't necessarily please them. And that creates another level of stress in the relationship. There's like a little tug going on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, now you're talking about boundaries. Between you and another person, right?
Right.
And so what you want to do is really step back, value yourself, think about what the outcome you want, and then communicate again facts, what I think, what I feel, what I conclude, and what I want, and negotiate with the other person rather than pleasing them. Please yourself, hold on to your own position, but don't hammer it over their head. Attempt to go through the communication profile and find a collaborative solution, a harmonious solution.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. The question that I was alluding to earlier that I had heard somebody say, and it was, who would you rather please? Yourself, or somebody else? In the end, which is most important to you? Because so often we give away our value, we give away our power, and then we are left with less than we started with. And if we're going to be whole and we're going to create positively for the world, we have to do that from a place of wholeness and not a place of deficit. Right.
And you don't want to just please yourself at the expense of other people. I mean, there are some people who are really difficult and oppositional, but not many. So you want to please yourself and the other people at the same time. That's win-win if you can do that. So it's a balancing act.
Right.
And I teach couples. It's a balancing act. The kids at school now, they all read books and practice pouring into each other's bucket as the metaphor for making other people feel good. I mean, if you're in a good relationship with somebody, you're pouring into their bucket. You're making them feel good, and vice versa. And that's what makes a really good relationship.
We had talked earlier about the importance to clarify the situation, to get to the facts of what's going on, whether you're in a personal relationship, whether it's a husband and wife, a couple, or whether it's employees, colleagues, or a relationship between an employer and an employee, that it is really important to be able to look at the facts. And one of the things from a business perspective that I would share with you is I designed a tool for one of my clients, and it's worked very effectively, and it's called a workplace incident report. So that instead of the employer having to figure out what happened and who's responsible and how to solve the problem, we went back to putting the responsibility on the employees involved by having them write down what actually happened, why they think it happened, like what was the process, focusing on the process instead of the people involved. Where did something break down, and how could they do it better? And it really did help to clarify situations for people. And we did it in a way that wasn't punishing. It was just simply, okay, this happened, fill out a workplace incident report. Let's get to the bottom of it so that it just doesn't happen again. Because we just get so embroiled in businesses very often. Everybody's so stressed about just getting to the goal, getting to the profit, getting the product out the door, that they are looking quickly to put blame on somebody because they fear what's going to happen if I don't get my job done. What's going to happen if I don't have the profit here to pay, or never mind the profit, if I don't have the income to pay my employees next week. But this workplace incident report really engaged the employees in taking responsibility for what happened, not because somebody's looking to blame them, but because they're just trying to figure it out so it'll be better the next time.
Right. That's a great instrument to use. An additional one that I've used, and I've seen used in a number of companies, is a weekly checkup at the end of a week or at the beginning of the week where employees get into small circles and they talk about how could my week have been better, rather than the blame game. How could my week have been better, and what do I want to happen next week? And that one often raises the energy level and gets people focused on how to make it better.
So what are you suggesting there, Diane? You think people should convene for a few minutes at the end of the week on Fridays and say, rah, rah, what are we going to do better next week? What was good about this last week, and how are we going to make it better, or how we could have made it better last week, and how can we make it better this week coming up?
Yeah, I think it's a mechanism, too, for, preventing people from carrying, whether it's grudges or arguments or carrying these over the weekend and make it wreck their own life and then bring it back to work on Monday. At least it's a venue for releasing some of the ideas and thoughts that people might be carrying around with them.
We started earlier in the conversation talking about the power of empathy. And I'm thinking that when we're talking about communication strategies in business, whether you're in business or personal, one of the communication strategies that I know is really important is being able to see things from another perspective by stepping into the other person's shoes.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about that, Dr. Kramer, so that our listeners understand kind of what happens emotionally and how seeing somebody else's perspective, making the effort to see it, can shift things.
Yeah. The empathy is something that in normal development we develop by the time we're 3 years old. Little kids start crying when they see their mother hurt or somebody hurt. Oh, do you want a Band-Aid? A lot of empathy. In certain households, though, there is no empathy, and it all has to do with modeling the parents. So we grow up, most of us, having empathy. Now, what is empathy? The empathy is the ability to, I call it, taste the soup. So you imagine yourself for a moment inside the body of the other person. If I were this other person, what would I be feeling, thinking, concluding? And you get the feeling in your own body. We can do this. Our brain is wired with what are called mirror neurons. So we can do like little, it's almost like a little representation of the other person. And that's how we do it. We kind of step into them in our mind, get the feeling of them, and then we go back into ourselves and say, okay, I get it. I know what's going on. And we also pick up cues from their facial expression, their voice tone, their body language, if you're really listening. So you can guess that way also about what somebody is feeling.
And so when you do that, and you start to get the sense of what the other person might be feeling, you can test that assumption by asking, like, wow, maybe not even asking, but maybe just saying, I imagine you are feeling this. Are you?
Right. That's great. Rather than telling them what they're feeling, because you may be wrong, right? But you're giving your conclusion. I imagine. And when you're right, wow, that's rapport. You click with the other person. They feel really understood. And if you're wrong, then you simply say, oh, so what are you feeling? And then they tell you, oh, I get it, you're feeling blah, blah, blah. And now you're back in rapport with them, in connection with them. So either way, you win by asking them.
When I was working in corporate at Olston Staffing Services, we did trainings on communication, and particularly trainings on feedback and how to deliver feedback effectively. And one of the great suggestions that we learned as part of the feedback process was that you own your feedback. That instead of saying to somebody else, you came in late today, you can own it which feels like an attack. You can say, I noticed that you weren't here on time today, but you owned it, you noticed it, and it feels less like an attack because you're just simply stating an observation. Yeah,
you could think of that. That goes along with boundaries, the idea of boundaries. So let's say you and I are in a room, and we're, say, 5 feet away from each other. So I can imagine the boundary being 2.5 feet. I can go only that far. So I make my I statements to you, right? If I go over that 2.5 feet, I'm in you territory. And I'm blaming, I'm complaining, I'm pointing out, I'm being a little bit obnoxious. But if I only go up to the boundary, I emit my I statements. Here are the facts. I think, I feel, I conclude, and I want.
And I think that's awesome. I want to take that from the other perspective now. So say you are making the I statement, and I'm the recipient of that statement. I now have to decide whether or not I'm going to take in the information that you gave me. A lot of people automatically react. So if, say, Pete says something to me that I don't like, I might feel that it's hurtful. I might just feel like I disagree. I can feel any range of emotions about it, but I can also make that taking in of the feeling my choice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first rule of good communication, well, even as you're getting the facts, but after you listen to the eyes of the other person, is to really listen. When you're really listening, you're not judging, you're not forming your own conclusions, you're not reacting emotionally, you're simply listening for understanding. And when you're listening for understanding, your job is to listen and feed back what you've heard to the other person in, say, a paraphrase until they shake their head. Oh, yeah, that's what I meant. When you're doing that, when you're feeding back, when you're in rapport, when you're paraphrasing, you don't have time to come up with judgments and emotionality. You're just in there being a good, reflective listener.
And then when you're reflecting, you're kind of getting to what the other person might be thinking and feeling about the situation, whether it's personal or whether it's business. And then you move to like really exploring the other person's viewpoint. How do you then, if you have a different viewpoint, what do you suggest is the way to share your thoughts and feelings with your compatriot?
Well, the first is first really listen and show that you've understood. That gives you the right to what I call pivot and tell your own point of view. But if the other person's point of view is really different than yours, what you might, even before you tell yours, you might go to find out their motivation. What's causing you to think that way? How did you arrive at that conclusion? How do you know that's the truth? How do you, without being challenging, if you could do it in an informational way, you learn far more about why the other person. I don't like the why question because a lot of people get very reactive to why. But what's driving this? What's motivating you? What are your reasons? You'll get much more. And if you're really listening, by the time you listen to all of that, you're not so reactive. You really represented inside yourself the other person. You're in empathy with that other person. You're not resisting them. You're not putting down a wall. And then it's much easier to float across the bridge, make an agreement, to negotiate the differences, to collaborate.
I think a lot of times people shy away from having those tough conversations. And
yeah.
I think people do that, number one, because they don't know how to have the conversation to get the outcome that they want. Number two, they fear that maybe it's just not going to be comfortable. And so they fall into that pattern of avoiding having the talk, and then you have the big elephant in the room.
Well, what a lot of people who shy away, it's because they themselves are afraid of losing control. They've never learned to express themselves without, a difference, without their anger. So they're afraid of, I can think of 10 people like this in my practice, they're afraid of losing control. So they keep it to themselves because they don't want to blast the other person. They think it's going to make it worse. And where did they learn that? They learned that in their childhood where they couldn't talk back to their parents because it would just make it worse. So they learned to swallow their voice, swallow their words, and go,
Well, I grew up in a family where children were seen and not heard, and you didn't interrupt the adult conversation, and you had to be very respectful of the older people in your family and really of anybody. And the message that I got from that was, don't say too much. Somehow I overcame that.
Yes.
And I right? So here
I'm laughing here.
Yeah, now she's on the radio talking all the time.
2 different stations. But the funny thing was, I think you're talking about personality parts. I think I have like this rebel personality because I went from we don't talk about the family, we don't talk outside the family. As a matter of fact, you're a kid, you don't talk too much at all. But they expected me to do really well in school, by the way. So I look back on that, and it's just very funny to me when I think about the shift that I made, because I went first out of college. I worked for a hypnosis center, which was all about a type of communication and influence communication. But I went from there into journalism, and I got to ask those nosy questions, and I got to get a voice out there. And then I ended up in public relations. So sometimes, like, those foundational experiences don't have to be your story. You actually can change them.
Well, look at me. I had the same family. I'm not related to you, but mine was a parallel family. We didn't talk about anything. And the children were to respect their elders, right? And here I became a clinical psychologist delving into everyone's psyche.
Right. And I think children should respect their elders. They need to learn that. Again, that's about teaching people proper boundaries and boundaries that are healthy for people. But you can't squash creativity. You can't, squash somebody's spirit. And I think that that's where the respect piece comes in. And it's like, if you think about business, how we were talking on an earlier show on a different station earlier today with Stephanie Leibowitz, and we were talking about leadership culture and how leadership used to be only the people at the top held all the knowledge. Only people at the top were allowed to talk. They were only the people who were allowed to, or the only people allowed to make the decisions and drive the way things were happening. But the world has changed, and families had historically been very top down. It was like the word of the father or the mother was the word. Today, and I guess kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, things started changing, and there's a lot more participation from the younger generation in terms of how families are running.
And I think there's a lot more spread of information also. So it's not such a top-down situation, that there's much more information available, especially to young kids today. Yeah. I mean, there's so much available to them that it's, I think what's changing is the controls. In other words, it's sort of like when your baby starts to walk. Yeah, that's a wonderful event. But all of a sudden, you've created this little thing that has no mind, that's going to walk and do whatever and get into everything. And that's kind of the way it is with young people today. They have a great deal of information at their fingertips, but not necessarily the experience to deal with it and to bring it to a meaningful conclusion, or to bring it into a meaningful experience.
And again, and Diane, I want you to weigh in on this, but I look at my life and my own family. I have 3 children, and I came from this very top-down information filter, and you listened, as we said, you listened to what your parents had to say, and you had to respect that. That meant not talking back. And now I look at my own children, and they are so forward with what they have to say. And sometimes I find myself reacting because I say, they're not supposed to talk back to me. But we need to start to learn how to shift perspective so that we understand where that other generation is coming from, especially back to the business topic too. And you please do weigh in on this. When you've got millennial generation, very different from Gen X, Gen Y, and even the senior people who've been around for a really long time.
Well, I think everyone needs to learn respect, but respect doesn't mean swallowing your voice. Respect means really listening to and respecting the other person's point of view and valuing it. So I don't have any discordance between respect and voicing. So what we've talked about so far is developing empathy for other people, right? Having respect for them, listening to the point where you really can validate them, finding out their reasons for why they think the way they do, negotiating from there, right? And when there's a conflict, starting with the facts. Start with the facts, then go to each person's feelings and conclusions and points of view and end up with asking for what you want. But somewhere along the way, you got to really understand where the other person is coming from. What's their virtual question? What are their criteria or their standards? And really try to understand each other.
And I think another thing, of course, is that people come to any particular situation with varying beliefs. And if your beliefs are discordant with the beliefs of the other person, or if what you're valuing as important is very different from what that other person values as important, you feel further apart. And then I think you have a fear of, as you talked about earlier, losing your position. And to some people, that's a threat.
Well, I think that's where bringing out the facts are important. That, it's not, a belief is one thing, but in a situation, you want to know the facts of the situation, regardless of your belief about them. It's best to try to get the facts out on the table and then move from there.
So when you have the facts, Diane, you're an expert in getting to win-win relationship. That takes negotiation. So when people get to a point where they're clear on the facts, they've developed a little bit of empathy, a little bit of rapport, how do you go from, okay, well, I want this and you want that, and how do we get to a common place?
Well, the first thing you do is check the selfishness gene at the door. Right?
Yep.
No, really.
I know they can do a lot with DNA these days, but...
But also checking our research on happiness and inner satisfaction comes most from giving. From giving, not from taking, but it's the giving that makes us feel good. So people need to learn this. The very selfish people they have deep psychological wounds that are making them be selfish. So we got to remember that. So the idea is to give, but not allow your arm to be cut off. What do they say? You give a hand and the other person takes the whole arm? No.
Give a foot they want.
You got to know, again, where your boundaries are. So a good way of doing that is to get clear, like for the person who's weaker, to get clear on your outcome before you go in there. What is a win-win outcome for this situation, right? Think about it in your own mind so that you have a target, a place to go, rather than just getting in there and having conversation.
Right.
Have an outcome where you want to be.
If we want to get to a place where we're both getting our needs met, both sides get their needs met, hopefully simultaneously, but maybe me first and you long range, or vice versa. There has to be a way to come to that. One of the things that I think is important in that is to think about how important it is to you. Are there some aspects of this that you can give away a little bit? And that's where you're talking also about the giving. There is something good in feeling like you're giving to the other person. And then you can also figure out what's so important to you and why it's so important to you that you need to hold the boundary when it's really important.
Let me just give an example from a couple I'm seeing right now. Where they're so cute. It's a young couple, and they're doing really, really well now. But the woman kind of modeled her very critical mother, right? So her husband, when he doesn't do anything perfect, she attacks him. So, because she's like her mother, and her mother's there every day, comes in and visits them and notices if a shelf hasn't been cleaned in the bathroom, for example. So, as she's learning to be more win-win, she's got to change her standards. She's got to give up her standards that were automatically set in her by her mother and develop her own standards that are win-win. Because it's our inner criteria or standards that determine a lot of how we feel about something, about a situation, about a person, about a place. So she's got to totally change her standards, and she's doing that. So, a lot of interchange has to take place in order to have this good communication and these good relationships.
Yeah,
and what about locking the mother-in-law out?
Only you would think of that, Pete. I don't know if women.
he doesn't even have a mother-in-law, but yeah, he doesn't have much practice. So what I think is really important then is for people when you're trying to get to the win-win relationship in business or in work, it's important to assess your own perceptions, really understand where you're coming from, and really try to listen to the other person so that you can get a sense of their own perception and keep going for the win-win. What's important to you? Why is it important? How is it important to you? How will it change things for you? How will it change things for us?
Yes.
And
I have another, I don't know how much more time we have, but there's a much longer topic that revolves around the business world and all of this, which is the type of corporate culture where there's a lot of emotional siding, there's triangles, there's politicking, there's, getting one's own little cuddle group together against the other group, and it ends up, in kind of a corporate wars rather than a harmonious, collaborative environment. And there's a lot to talk about there. And from the field of family therapy, we learn a lot about how these organizational systems, the communications, the patterns, play out in such a way to be dysfunctional for people and hurtful.
yeah, and I think that's a fantastic topic that we can take up in another show because we've got 3 minutes and 43 seconds left to go here. Pete Anselmo has something to say.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that I think that what we've been talking about has a great application in the sales situation where you're not really trying to convince somebody to buy something. It's really an effort to strive to reach the win-win circumstance where you're providing a need or a product or what have you that the customer wants or needs, and you're presenting your what your business does for them. And so the idea is to reach that win-win circumstance where it's a give and take with the customer in terms of the value and in terms of how it's going to serve their needs. So it's very applicable to the selling situation to be aware of the needs of the person or your customer in addition to the needs or the certain not skills, but there's certain limits that you have in the selling situation with your product. So you try to reach that win-win boundary.
Yes, very well said. And, I mean, the parts of that, of course, that are applicable, I mean, I went through lots of different sales training programs and courses, and they all taught rapport skills. Like, the first thing you do is learn to be a good listener. And you want to listen to the point where you're hearing the other person's problem, your clients, potential clients, problem or pain. And then you're painting a picture of, you're really listening, you're feeding back to them, you hear their pain, and then you paint a picture of how you can help them solve the problem.
Exactly, because it really, in the end, it relies on good communication, making your prospect, helping your prospect to understand the value that you're bringing. But that value is really an act of service. And when you are going in to see a customer, it shouldn't be about the money you want to take away. It really should be about how you're going to solve the problem and make their life easier because you're there to serve them. And that's what customer service is all about. I want to thank Dr. Diane Kramer for being with us today. Diane, how can people reach you if they're interested in marriage therapy or if they are interested in knowing more about some of the programs you provide? And we didn't get much to talk about the e-learning today, but we're going to pick that up in another show because I know you're going to be with us a lot. So just let our listeners know how to reach you.
Okay, a simpler email than my usual, peakskills@gmail.com. That's PEAKSKILLS @gmail.com, or 631-553-1476.
Well, I want to...
Yeah.
631-553-1476.
Yeah, and I do distance therapy, I do business consulting therapy, all of that.
We're going to leave it there for today. This is Donna Anselmo and Pete Anselmo with Bold Talk Business Radio. We would like you to visit our blog for more information on Bold Talk Business Radio, and that is boldtalkbusinessradio.com. Thanks for listening to us at Talk Network Radio today. We love being here. It's a great place.